When I read the topic on laser sent it out, I thought it was labor as in working.
As in labor
Yeah.
relations?
Yeah.
And labor
Everybody's
relations.
first reaction.
Okay, well,
Maybe
we're
that's
gonna,
kind of like-
That's not.
we're gonna be talking about the other kind of labor tonight.
Not in America, not in the US.
That's right.
That's right. I actually, how did I spell it?
May not be you.
Like an American.
That's okay.
I'm sorry, guys.
5% TRS if you don't.
So later in the, his, message is that it's spelled the Canadian.
Exactly, which is.
That's right.
All right, so the question, I want to first start off by sharing with you a question. These questions do come up. A couple of months ago, I received the following email. I'm hiding the identity of the person. Hi, Rabbi Korupkin. I hope you're doing well. I have a time-sensitive halakhic question for you. God willing, I am expecting, and my due date is, I'm not going to tell you what that is, and I am just past 39 weeks. I was told by my OB that the recommendation is to induce at 39 weeks for women who are giving birth at my age, since there is a slight elevated chance of stillbirth. So this is a woman who's had already a number of children. This is probably in her maybe late 30s, early 40s, and is told by her obstetrician that there's a slightly higher risk of stillbirth if she goes to full term, okay? My history with my other births has been to give birth past my due date, with my two last pregnancies delivering naturally at 10 and 11 days overdue, okay? Although the typical recommendation is to induce at 39 weeks, my doctor is not insisting on this and has allowed me to finish my week of teaching this week, given how my pregnancy has progressed until now, Baruch Hashem. She mentioned the possibility of an induction this Sunday or Monday, which is just before 40 weeks, but is leaving the decision up to me entirely as to when and if I want to be induced. I am turning to you to please weigh in. From a halakhic standpoint, should I proceed with an induction right before 40 weeks or wait and monitor the situation? I thank you very much for your time and look forward to hearing back from you. All the best. So you put on your posek caps. What would you tell this woman? This very
Sakana involved? There's no sakana involved. Right?
well, I just read to you what you heard it exactly as it was presented to me. If there was a sakana involved, do you think the obstetrician would leave it up to her to decide? Okay.
Hopefully.
All right. So any inclination?
What's the halakhic issue with induction?
That's what we're going to find out. Are there any halachic problems with inducing labor early? Let's say a person, I'll tell you what, I'm a January baby, okay? My parents always used to kid around that I was overdue. I was supposed to be born in 1963 in December, and they would have gotten the tax write-off. So their running joke is, it's my fault that they didn't get a tax write-off in 1963, okay? What if a man is a CPA and he says to his wife, you're due at around January 4th, let's induce you. We'll be able to take a tax credit. Sounds reasonable. What if the obstetrician says, I'm leaving town 2 days before your due date. We have someone else who can deliver the baby, but I know I've delivered your last 3 babies. I'm used to, you as a patient. It's up to you. Would you like to use me and we can induce you early? There could be a number of reasons why a woman would want to be induced early. Here, the obstetrician is saying that it's medically recommended, because she's a little bit older, not to come to the 40-week term, okay? So, but he says it's, just because something is recommended means that if there's no other compelling reason, yeah, you might as well go ahead and do it. But is what we want to discover if in halacha there is a compelling reason to not induce. And that's what we want to discover tonight. So we're going to look at 2 texts. One is a tshuva from Rav Moshe, which he later wrote he reiterated it in a later tshuva, but this is the main tshuva. And then we're going to look at Reb Zilberstein's Sefer, which is all about the halachas of childbirth. And the very first chapter talks about the induction of labor. Okay, so here is the tshuva from Rav Moshe. Let's take a look at it together. We're not looking at the whole tshuva because there's some lumdis at the end, but let's take a look at the beginning. And Rav Moshe has like a really a very, what's the word I'm looking for? A very innovative approach to the whole concept of childbirth. Be'inyan hakdamas leida al yedei tachbulot, v'hakdamas leida deisha. Let me just make sure I'm sharing my screen. Here we go. So he says, is it okay to use different methods to induce labor? V'hakdamas leida deisha shapam harishon haya benituach derech dofen im rishoyin. So, and are you allowed to induce labor in light of the fact that her previous birth was born by cesarean section? Would that be permitted? And I'm not sure what this abbreviation stands for. Is it the date, I think? Oh, Hey Menachem Av Tafshin Lamed. Thank you. Malas Kvod Yedidi Harav Agona Meforsa Marina Harav Shmuel Tuvia Stern, who actually I'm related to through my wife, Rav in Miami Beach. Rav Shmuel Tuvia Stern was a big kashrus guy. He did a lot of kashrus. Hine bedavar harofe shemiyaitz.
I came in late for the intro, but this is a different question altogether.
Well, he's asking two questions. In general, the induction of labor, and specifically a case where a woman was C-section the first delivery, and now they're recommending inducing the second time.
How are you translating tachbulot?
Tachbulot methods or different techniques, I would say.
I'm be saying tricks.
Well,
Ruse,
yeah. So a tachbula can have a negative connotation, like a trick, but it's also a technique.
It'd be very rare for them to actually induce after a cesarean section. They could let it go naturally, what they call a VBAC, vaginal birth after cesarean, but induction contractions tend to be much stronger. So you guys not agree with that? To actually induce somebody once they've had a cesarean? Well, the chances in the meeting another cesarean are marketing. Oh. Yeah.
Sit back.
Maybe, I don't know.
Well, that's what I was.
There's a higher
The second
incidence of
case is a
cesarean
VBAC.
than induced labor.
The second case is a VBAC, right? Vaginal birth after cesarean, which is a whole risk issue.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's very, very, very different than a regular.
Okay.
Two difference.
Is it possible they would want to induce so that they can do another C-section?
No.
No,
Would
that
not
wouldn't.
want-
Okay.
Wouldn't want any labor.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see where we're going with this. Hine bidvar harofei shemiyaitz lisha shechashva shekalu lo hachadashim likvoa sha'a lahaktim haleida al yedei tachbulot. So here's the case. A doctor is advising a woman who they believe has come full term. And the doctor is saying, well, come in on Monday morning, let's induce you. For whatever reason. Shekvo tarasu mitzadei la'asar. So Rav Stern is leaning towards saying that you cannot do that. Hine ani lo shamati she'efshar la'asot kein beleida derech harechem, ela she'osim kein harofim lahanashim shebeleida harishona utzruchu lahotzi b'nituach derech dofan. He says, I have never heard that it would be advised that it would be okay to do this if the objective is to do a birth vaginally. But doctors do this for women whose previous birth was cesarean. And the doctors feel that she will also, the second time, not be able to give birth vaginally because the vaginal canal is too narrow. Or I guess her anatomy won't tolerate that's, the baby coming through. Shebazeh omrim laharofim she'en lachakot ad shiyu lachevle haleda So the doctors in that case do not set a date. Sorry, they don't wait until she goes into labor. Ela kovin lo yom layom la'asot hanituach. But what they do is they set a date. This is when your cesarean is going to be. Kishelafi umdana shel harofim hu kvar higia zman haleida be'erech. And they say, this is the date where we think the baby will have come approximately to full term or near full term. So therefore, it's safe for the baby to be born. So they're not inducing. They're not like giving her Pitocin or anything like that to induce labor, but they're basically setting an appointment for her to come in and to do the C-section. Uvazeh leka tam kvod toraso de'ein lahavi et ha'isha lidei pikuach nefesh chutz l'derech hateva me'achar delefi da'at harofei mumcha behechrich tia later shelo b'nituach shelo b'derech hateva. He says there's no reason for restraining her from doing that, because based on the doctor's estimation, this is an issue of pikuach nefesh, because the doctor who's the expert says that she's going to need a C-section. She's just simply not going to be able to deliver any other way. In other words, she's not going to be able to deliver naturally. And so there, Rav Moshe says, if the doctors already know that she's not going to be able to deliver naturally, and they're going to have to do a C-section, he doesn't see any reason to say that that would be prohibited, right? Aval al kol panim nira, the kaven she'efshala lechakot ein lahakdim. However, it would still seem that she shouldn't do it any earlier than she needs to. Deha kol nituach hu gam b'chashash sakana, ve'ein lahakdim hacholi uchashash sakana. He says, because since every surgery involves risk, you don't want to hasten taking the risk. If you can delay taking the risk, that would be preferred.
You're specifically talking about inducing by means of surgery and not by means.
No,
of
there's no induction here that Rav Moshe is talking about. In the case that he's discussing, there's a woman who's going to need a C-section. So there's no induction. It's really just a surgical procedure to open up her abdomen and extract the child. There's no induction, right? Am I right? Is that the correct thing? Okay. So Rav Moshe says no reason to prohibit because she's not going to be able to deliver naturally anyway. But it's still better to wait as long as you can and not to do it too early, because you don't want to hasten putting someone in a makom sakana.
But she will have to have the surgery.
She will have to have the surgery. Wait as long as you can. Let's see. Degam al zeh shayach inyan chaye sha'a below choli, shegam ken ya'ish lanu lachush milasot choli v'chabura kodem azman. He says, because there's a concept of every moment of life is precious. That's what we call chaye sha'a. You want to preserve chaye sha'a as long as you can. So therefore, we don't want to cause her injury through the surgery any earlier than absolutely necessary. Even though it's just a matter of days of waiting until we're going to have to deliver the baby in this way. And it's furthermore healthier for the child to stay in the gestative state in his mother's womb until it's absolutely necessary to pull him out. And therefore, too, deliver the baby earlier than necessary would also be not only hastening the risk for mom, but also compromising the health of the child unnecessarily. And furthermore, says Rav Moshe, I'll take it one step further. Maybe the doctor is mistaken in his estimation. Maybe she could deliver the baby vaginally. Because it does happen. What was that acronym that you called it? VBAC. Vaginal birth after cesarean. VBAC. So maybe it sounds like a Yiddish word. Ich weiß, VBAC. Yeah. So anyway, Umasha harambam beperish hamishnayis bechoros perak yesh bechor kosav demasha omrim hamagidim shehaisha chaya achar shekorim dofna umit aberet violedet eni yodea lo tam v'hu inyan zar ma'od. So the Rambam actually says in his Perish Mishnayos that it's virtually impossible for a woman to have a regular vaginal birth after having had a cesarean. The way he describes it is they had cesarean surgery in the times of the Rambam, even the times of the Gemara. But he calls it tearing open the stomach in order to extract the child. How could it possibly be, the Rambam says, that she could carry a baby regularly after that? But the Rav Moshe says, even though the Rambam says it's davar muzar, it's really something that he doesn't think is possible. And he was a doctor after all, right? But hine bizmanenu hu masim la'alafim kahamagidim sha'osim nituach lahotzi havla derech doifan v'chayot umitabrot v'yoldot. But today in modern medicine, 1,000 years after the Rambam, it's actually quite common. It's quite prevalent.
1970.
Yeah.
In 1970, if you asked an obstetrician, would you deliver a baby when your first delivery was by cesarean section?
Yeah.
Vaginal? Answer would be unequivocally no.
Really?
Because the risk is uterine rupture. That's what the Rambam is referring to.
Okay.
Chance of having uterine rupture, the baby will die. It's only when VBAC became a very, very big push in the last 2 decades or so that hospitals are pushing for that, trying to reduce whatever.
Yeah.
Huge
Mhm.
amounts of politics to try to do it, but the old school.
The old school didn't believe in it.
It's gonna be a.
Okay, so if you have access to these old journals back in the 1970s, see if you can find any literature where VBAC was being advocated as early as 1970. We'd be curious.
ChatGPT, right? Do that later.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
I happened to see an episode of Call the Midwives right in the beginning of the 1970s, and they were telling the woman that she'd have to have a cesarean. In the
Really?
episode, she gave.
Interesting,
birth.
interesting.
It was really-
Remind me, are you a midwife? No.
No, but
Okay.
similar to accounting.
Right, you're an accountant, yeah. Okay.
They say it's practice.
In any event, v'hu min hanituchim she'einam besakana kol kach, that after all, a C-section is a surgery that is not that dangerous. V'harofim omrim she'ein ze sakana klal v'ulai nishtanu hatvorim mizman harambam. Doctors say there's no risk at all, and therefore VBACs are quite common. And however, maybe the teva changed since the times of the Rambam. V'lochein, that's all parenthetical. But the bottom line is, it could be that the doctor is mistaken in his estimation that she won't be able to deliver vaginally. V'lochein, ein la'asot kein afilu be'ilu shetzrichot lenituach derech doifan, and therefore don't hasten or deliver prematurely when a woman even for sure needs a C-section. V'tzarech lechakot ad shetargish chevlei haleida v'yomru harofim she'i efshar lechakot. And you have to really wait until she begins labor. And the doctors say, we cannot wait any longer. Im lo, unless the yomru harofim sheleisha zu sakana lechakot az yu mutarim lahotzi bizman sheyomru. Unless the doctors say, with a certain level of certainty, that it's a sakana for her to go full term. If they say it's a sakana for her to go full term, so then just do it whenever the doctors say you should do it. V'im kein lo shayach la'asot kviyat bizman kodem ledina. But even then, try to push it off to the last possible date where the doctors say it's safe for her to deliver. Okay?
Would be the same if the sakana is for the child, for the kid?
Yeah. Either way, whenever there's a sakana, or the doctors believe that there's a sakana or even suffix sakana, go with the doctors. But remember, there's a difference between suffix sakana and the thing that I just told you, the shaila that I read for you, where you can see the doctor's not saying there's a suffix sakana mamish. The doctors are saying there is this greater risk, but it could be a very small risk of stillbirth if you go full term and you're 42 years old, let's say. But from a statistical standpoint, it's probably still a very, very low statistic of stillbirths. But the doctor is saying you want to avoid all risk, then we'll induce you early, okay?
Practically speaking, I mean, this is a little bit inaccurate. The reason they set the date is they want the date for the section to be before the labor. And now they're saying, wait till labor starts and then go right away. Right away, when that happens, there's increased risk.
Right.
Yeah.
You're gonna get a crash section and.
Yeah, my wife had a C-section when she was well into labor because the cord was wrapped around the baby's neck. So you can do a C-section.
Plan C-section after.
That's the goal. We're gonna plan the section before we think you go into labor. Oh, you went into labor before your date, come on in and we'll take care of you. But that's not, it's not like wait until you go into labor and then come for the section. And who has a surgical schedule that can accommodate that kind of logistic?
Well, I mean, doctors who are obstetricians always have to come at unexpected times, no?
Doesn't always happen at night, happens during the day, got a
Okay.
full slate of the OR.
Yeah,
You know, they don't do it, they don't do that.
okay.
Yeah.
So did Rav Moshe change, originally we said, Razel Lekatam.
Referring to Rav Stern's argument to Aser, he said, I don't agree that there's any reason to Aser in a situation where the umdana of the Rofim is that she absolutely needs a C-section. So bring her to that point where the doctors feel shekvar higia zman haleida be'erech, that the time of the late has already arrived. And so it could be that he's equivocating a bit. It could be he's saying that he's backtracking and saying, if she, well, not necessarily. Sounds like he's saying that if she hasn't reached term, it's better to wait until the very last minute before you have to deliver the baby, before you perform the surgery. It might even be better, he says, to wait until she goes into labor. And here he's probably talking about where it's not full term yet. You know, wait until the very last minute that you can. That seems to be what he's saying now. I don't think he's being choser. I think he's saying in the previous case, if the doctors feel she's reached full term and she's not, there's no option, zero option for her to deliver regular, so then it's okay, perfectly okay. Now, he hasn't told us yet. Now,
Is why that if there's a risk of dying from surgery, we want to push that death to have as much life as possible.
right. So it sounds like what he's leading to is that he's a naturalist in the sense that he feels nature is always safer than the unnatural path, right? Than intervention. That seems to be the direction he's going in. And now he's going to say that more explicitly, okay?
Would he also say therefore that no pain reduction would be allowable?
We're not going to talk about pain tonight. Not going to talk about pain tonight. That's a separate shaila. It's a good shaila, but we're not going to get into that in this particular instance. Now, the im ika mitziut kasher shama kvot taraso. Sha'af leleida derech rechem kovin yom mesuyam etzel harofe lasot tachbulot shetelet et havlad. He says, now, Rav Moshe says, I've never heard of this, but you Rav Stern claim that sometimes they will even make an appointment to induce a woman to give birth vaginally also. He says, Af she'enam al yedei nituchim ela belekichat samanim. And it's not through surgery, but rather through the taking of medication. And the medication causes a woman to go into labor prematurely, and some places do that. Nami yesh la'esor im eno ba'ofan shemekasher le'lei deyesh la'isha sakana. Here too, you cannot permit it unless it's very difficult for a woman to give birth at full term, and there's doctors say it's a sakana for you to come full term, so we need to induce you early. Af sheleka hata'amim shekatavti. Even though the reasons that I've written above don't apply, because with a C-section, we want to wait until the last possible minute to avoid sakana to the mother and sakana to the child, right? Here, the argument could be, let's induce you, if you haven't given birth by Monday, which is your due date, we'll induce you on Monday. Why should I say that it's usher? See, here's what Rav Moshe says. Shaharei eino osa chabura b'nituach, elamaktim leida hativit shal yedei hasamanim teleid leida tivit. So Rav Moshe says, you might argue, what's the problem here? You're not doing any kind of surgical procedure to bring a woman to sakana. which is why I'm hesitant to permit you to do a C-section too early. So here, all you're doing is you're giving her Pitocin to induce labor, and she's going to have a natural birth. So what's wrong with that? Mitzad shelahavlad tov liot babeten ha'em adazman sha'ita yoledet me'atzma. So Rav Moshe says, because the reality is, trust God's process, essentially is what he's saying. God wants that child to be in utero until the baby's ready to come out. Even, one second, please be patient. Even if the doctor says you've come to full term, but the natural process is to wait until she goes into labor. That's the natural process. Va'afim lifa'amim, iko umdana meharofim shelav havlad leka shum to'elet. And what if the doctors say, you know what, there is no more benefit for the baby? I remember when my wife gave birth to some overdue babies, the skin was more shrivelly, right? There are certain, correct me if I'm wrong, Laser, there are certain symptoms of an overdue baby. There's more skin that is peeling, right? And
The amniotic fluid is down. There's too little amniotic fluid.
maybe there's too little amniotic. Oh, 1 second. You're saying that this may be harmful to the child. 1 second. 1 second. He says, here he's not saying that it's a sakana to keep the baby in longer. He says, what if the doctors simply say there's no benefit, there's no further benefit to keep the child in utero any longer? Nami ika svarat kvo torato, mitzad she'etzem haleda hu inyan choli v'sakana ein lahagdim. He says, but your argument, Rav Stern, that hastening Leda, hastening birth, is hastening a woman to put her into a makom sakan.
With the props.
Good timing.
Yeah, good timing. Yeah, although that doesn't sound like a newborn. Af shehi ota sakana tivit atzma. Even though it is a natural sakana that all women undergo when they go into labor, but you should not hasten that natural sakana earlier than it needs to be. Imlo yomru harofim sheyesh sakana lechakot, unless the doctors say that it's posing a risk if we let you go any longer. If the doctors say that there's a health hazard to either mom or baby by letting her go beyond a certain date, then you have to induce. But if the doctors are saying that it's okay to wait, but for whatever reason of convenience or whatever other reason, not having to do with health, they want to induce early, that you should avoid, he says, based on the svara that we mentioned above, that you should not hasten putting someone in a makom sakana. That's the first argument. Avalanias daiti yeshtam yoter barur laesor. But in my opinion, says Rav Moshe, so Rav Tuvia Stern's argument, why bring a woman to a makom sakana any earlier than necessary, would be the argument to prohibit induction that it's not indicated medically, okay? But I have another reason, says Rav Moshe, why induction should not be done. Delayda bizmana kederach hanashim lo nechshav l'sakana klal. He says, because giving birth on the date that Hashem wants you to give birth is not considered a sakana. Now listen to this. This is like a huge chiddush, what Rav Moshe is saying. Deme'achar shekein bara Hashem yizbarach es ha'olam sheyifru v'yirbu ubevadai bara sheyeh libracha v'lo l'sakana. As a general rule, God created man and woman in such a way that that's how babies are born. If the population of the world happens through childbirth, then it must be that God wants it's the will of God that it should be done safely. That it should, 1 second, let's just finish his thought. That it should not be in a situation that's going to cause danger. V'gam ha'tziva Hashem yisbarach b'chiyuv aseh laholid banim. And God commands us, it's a positive mitzvah to have children. V'lo mistaver she'yeh hatzivoy likanes b'sakana b'shvil kiyum asezu depriya urvia. And it makes no sense, he says, that God would demand that we have to endanger our lives in order to fulfill a positive mitzvah. So ergo, there really can't be any sakana involved in natural childbirth. Now, this sounds crazy because we haven't finished the idea. Let's finish the idea first. ובפרט שהנשים אין מחויבות בהעשה דפרייה ורבייה, שנצטרך לומר שנוסנה התורה להם רשות להיכנס בסכנה להוליד בנים. And even one step further, a woman is not commanded to in the mitzvah of pru or vu. If a woman is not commanded in the mitzvah of pru or vu, then how in the world could God tell a woman that she has permission to endanger her life to do something that she's not commanded to do? What right does a person have to enter themselves into a makom sakana when there's no reason to, when there's no mitzvah for a woman to have children? So what right does Hashem expect women to do this? And therefore, so he says, Elatzarich lomar she'ein bazeh sakana klal. We therefore maintain that there is no sakana in natural childbirth. Hainu shehivtiach Hashem yitbarach shelo yihiyeh bazeh sakana leolam. And basically what God is saying, have kids, have children, have babies, and there's no sakana in having babies. Now, what about the fact that some women die in childbirth?
Rachel Imenu.
Rachel Imenu and others. Umashi ira shemetot bishat leidatan, hurak machmat shemechuyavot onesh. He says the only reason women die in childbirth, again, we're getting the sound effects, is because women are being punished by God, and God chooses an opportunity to punish them in the course of childbirth. Kiditnan b'Shabbos daf lamed aleph.
That's just where we're at, close to the air conditioners.
So is he literally saying that every woman who dies in
Hold
childbirth?
on. All I ask is that you let us finish his idea, and then we can discuss it. Okay? Because it's an outlandish idea until we actually give him a chance to finish. He says, Kiditnan b'Shabbos daf lamed aleph al shalosh averos nashim mesos bishas ledasan. As the Mishnah in Masechet Shabbos says, we say this in Bameh Batlikin, that it is for 3 sins that women die in childbirth. In other words, God chooses to cause their demise in a moment of childbirth. What are those 3 things? Because al she'enan zihiros, benida, bechala, uvahadlaka saner. Okay, fine. Ulefizeh hurak beleida debizmana, sha'al ze ika havtachat Hashem yitbarach bebriato, uvitzivoy ha'aseh depriya uravia shelo tistakein. So listen to his argument. If God promises that childbirth is safe, it's only under the rubric of natural childbirth. In other words, if a person were to tamper with the natural process of childbirth, they no longer have God's guarantee that this is a safe procedure, that childbirth is a safe thing. He's speaking quite theologically now. His theological argument is that the Ribono Shel Olam told us to procreate. If God told me to procreate, it must be that this is a safe thing to do. And he's giving his imprimatur and his guarantee that I will be protected. So if that's the case, I only have that guarantee so long as I use God's natural system. But once I tamper with the natural system that God gave us to have children, I no longer can assume the guarantee that God gave that childbirth is safe. And therefore, anytime I tamper with the system by inducing labor, I'm sort of leaving God's protective guarantee, and therefore I'm increasing sakana. So that's his argument. He says, the ha'onesh bishvil chet the eitz hadas hu rak yisurim dechevle leida v'lo mita chas v'shalom. And he says, it's true that Chava was punished with birth pangs, but birth pangs does not mean death. But by inducing labor, you no longer are under God's umbrella protection of safe childbirth. And therefore, anytime you induce labor, you are now entering in a sakana situation because you're no longer under God's protection or his sort of guarantee of that childbirth is safe. ולכן הוא דבר אסור לעשות תחבולות להקדים לידה, אם לא כשאיכא סכנה לחכות כדלעיל. And therefore, you are never allowed to induce labor purely for non-medical reasons, i.e. for convenience reasons or things like that. But if there's a situation where the doctors say that it's a sakana to let her go full term and do it naturally, then you would be allowed to induce. Okay, so it's crazy when you think about it. It's because it's like, it's min hakatzeh el hakatzeh, like two opposites. When the doctors say there's a sakana, so then you should induce labor. It's your mechuyev to induce labor. When the doctors do not require you to induce labor, by inducing early, you're causing a woman to leave God's divine protection of that childbirth is safe. And therefore, you're doing a disservice to both mother and child because they no longer have God's sort of warranty that childbirth is a good thing and a safe thing. What about the fact that certain women throughout history, and even to this day, die in childbirth? That's got nothing to do with God's protective mechanism over childbirth. That's simply because they're dying because of a completely separate decision that they deserve to die. And the moment that Hashem deems them deserving to die is during childbirth. Okay, go ahead.
So far
Miriam.
more women died in childbirth in times before we had medical procedures that we have today.
Correct.
So were women much more sinful in those? I mean, doesn't bear out.
No, it's not that women were more sinful, but we do need to take into account a number of things. Yes, it's true that more women died in childbirth 100 years ago than they died today. But you know what else happened more 100 years ago? Men and women died in their 50s and 60s. And that doesn't happen anymore today either. Does that mean that people 100 years ago were more sinful than they are today? No, of course not. It just means that we have figured out new techniques. Every era has a new way for Hashem to either protect or not protect people's lives and prolong people's lives or not prolong. But it doesn't necessarily change the theology. The theology still might be a sound theology, and each era that a person lives through has a different sort of set of parameters as to what's as to how to view what's safe and what's not safe.
He's saying natural, going natural will be under the umbrella of God's protection, using any intervention. Forget about an induction, maybe even having a midwife beside you is not perfectly natural, maybe perfectly natural.
Right. So he's not saying that. He's not saying that medical assistance is unnatural. He's saying the induction of labor is unnatural.
Where does the line?
That's a good question. It's a fair question. What about using forceps, right? So these are all fair questions. I'm not saying that this shaila is completely crystallized and removes any gray area, but it is very insightful as to see how Rav Moshe is thinking about this. Okay, so far, yes, Eddie.
I have two questions on this. So he said at one point, Rav Moshe said at one point that how could we, there must be no danger to natural childbirth, because how would we expect a woman to voluntarily enter this process if there were danger? But
Right.
I actually thought that there was an opinion that the reason why they're not commanded to do Peru is because there is danger, and God wouldn't command a woman to.
Interesting. It seems like Rav Moshe is not subscribing to that idea. We don't. The question is, how do we know that only men are commanded in Pru Urvu? And that's based on the fact that when God gave the mitzvah of Pru Urvu, Chava had not yet been created or extracted from man. So that's how we understand that there's no mitzvah of Pru Urvu separately for a woman. Could the reason have to do with the fact that it might be because she's causing herself sakana? I have no doubt that there are some Meforshim who opine that, but Rav Moshe doesn't seem to believe that. Rav Moshe seems to believe that you have to conclude, even for the man, where there's a mitzvah, how can a man put another human being into sakana? How can he? What heter do I have to put my wife in a makam sakana by impregnating her?
She still hasn't been to Shev Sitira.
Does she still have that mitzvah? That's unclear. Whether that mitzvah applies to the Achronim Claire, whether Lasheves Yitzara applies to individuals or applies to mankind in general. So it's not, I don't believe it's one of the Taryag mitzvahs, right? It's definitely not one of the Taryag mitzvahs because it's not in the Torah. It's a question that, but there is an obligation for civilization as a whole to procreate. Whether that is placed on the individual, though, I don't think it is. But I haven't researched it carefully enough.
Right, because it's the reason why it's for men is because it's the Zerach and I'm saying the both. The Gemara.
And that's the reason for what? For Pru or Vu?
For male.
For male only.
That's what that he was saying is the Meshech Chochmah.
Is that what the Meshech Chochmah says?
He says that the Ran said that there's no mitzvah for a woman and she's a messiah at best. But how would the Meshech Chochmah said Deracheo Darchi Noam? How could we put a woman through this? So that you have to.
So Rav Moshe doesn't subscribe to this Meshech Chochmah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So the conclusion what we said was that so if there's if there's a danger, if there's a sakana, then we have to induce. But if it's just for convenience, then it's forbidden. But the original question we asked was sort of somewhere in between there. Like there's a slight increased risk of stillbirth if she goes to full term, but the doctor didn't think it was a big enough risk that he really strongly recommended.
So, okay. So based on what we've seen in Rav Moshe, what would you advise that woman?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
The question is, woman, this is the real life question. A woman is in her 40s. She's had multiple births successfully already. All of her previous births were overdue, like by over a week. But the doctor is saying that if you go full term, there's a slightly elevated risk when you give birth in your 40s of stillbirth. And therefore, it's indicated by the medical community to induce labor before you go full term, but only because of that slight elevated risk, the doctor is not mandating that it must be done. He's saying it's up to you to decide. So, based on Rav Moshe's tshuva, what would you say?
No.
Can't do it.
Yes.
No can do.
Yeah, Miriam, you would say, yes, go ahead and induce.
Because we're talking again about a medical reason to
He's
decrease
leaving it up to her.
Laser?
Even if it's a small shot, but there's a medical risk now. There's a medical benefit. It's different than saying.
Well, if there's a medical risk, then why would the doctor say, I leave it up to you?
Because there is some element in both. There's a risk in both. You don't want to. Doctors don't want to induce for just for no reason at any other time. But
I understand, but how much of an increased risk is there of stillbirth? Is it maybe 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100,000? At what point do we say that the risk is so minimal and then there's a counter indication for some other reason? Either because we're hastening putting her into a makom sakana by inducing labor, or maybe we're compromising the baby's health to some degree, slightly perhaps. How do we know which one is more of a risk? Okay, all of this Adkan is Rav Moshe. I want to share with you something else that I had also heard in Rav Moshe's name, but it doesn't appear in the Igros Moshe. But Rav Zilberstein has a whole sefer called Torah Yoledet, which is all about the laws of having children, all about the laws of childbirth. In the very first chapter of that sefer, he paskins as follows in Perek Aleph, Seif Aleph, Hakdamat Zaman Haleda, hastening the time of birth. Nashim hamevakshot lahakdim zman lidatan al yedei matan terufa hagoremet lahofat chevlei leda. If a woman wishes to induce labor so that she can give birth early, mishum shenoach lahen shahaleda tiyeh biyom mesuyam, because it's more convenient that the birth be on a specific day, o kedei shahaleda lo tiyeh b'Shabbos, or because they want to avoid having to go into the hospital on the Sabbath, al ya'asu zot. They should not do this. In other words, if it's not medically related, you should not induce labor so that she gives birth early. Now, I just want to point out before we go into the notes, the rest of this chapter gives exceptions to that rule when there are very valid reasons that a woman has medically to induce labor. So it's not like he's saying categorically you should never induce. If it's purely for non-medical reasons, it's inconvenient, or I want this particular doctor and not that other doctor to deliver, or some other reason, then it's considered to be not indicated, something that you shouldn't do. Now, we want to discuss why. The reasons that are provided in the footnotes are completely different, and I just want to get through these two first points. So first he quotes in footnote Aleph, he says, Kosav b'sefer harokeach al koheles perek gimel pasuk yud Aleph, et hakol asa yafeh bi'ito. He says there's a pasuk in Koheles that says God made everything in its time, good in its time. And the Rashi Tevot of et hakol asa yafeh bi'ito are the four words, hakol asa yafeh bi'ito, be'ah. Kolomar be'ah below zmana I efshar sheteled. So what is be'ah? Could be the egg, right? So in other words, an egg at the wrong time will not be born properly. V'gam et ha'elem kol shekain shemamtin et ito u'chedichtiv hayadate et laledet. I'm not so sure what this next point is. V'gam et ha'elem. What does the whole pasuk say in Koheles? Let me just see. Koheles Perek Gimel pasuk Yud Aleph. Just give me one sec.
The Elaine referring to that.
Perek Gimel pasuk Yud Aleph. Es hakol asa yafeh bi'ito gam et ha'olam natan bilibam. Right, and the whole world God places in their heart. Mibli asher lo yimtza ha'adam et ha'ma'aser asher asa Elokim merosh ve'ad sof. To the point where no human being can understand why God makes things, because no human being can see from the beginning to the end. That's the Gam et ha'olam, Natan bilibam, that the whole world God has placed in sort of into motion with a certain system, and human beings simply don't understand. So that's what he's quoting from. So he says, Kol shekain shemamtinet ito. And so therefore we know certainly that God always waits for the proper time for birth to take place. U'chedichtiv hayadat et laledet. And as God, I believe, said to Eov, do you know the proper time to give birth? Lakach ein la'asot lemekasheshet tamher leleid, pen teleid b'mazal ra. And therefore you should not cause someone to give birth prematurely, lest the child be born at a bad time, during a bad mazel. Now, what does that mean? Don't let someone be born at a bad mazel. Take a look at the Hakdama Ravid L'Sefer Yetzira. The Ravid says a similar idea in his Hakdama, in his introduction to Sefer Yetzira, which is an ancient text written, certainly the version we have is from the times of the Gaonim. It says, V'hinei haleida b'koach Hashem. That birth is something that is provided, a force that is provided by God. Ki hu hamatir chevlei leida. V'tzarcha taladat, ki be'oto rega sheha'isha yoledet milamata, haneshama nishlemet milamala. You have to know that the moment that a woman gives birth to a baby, that baby's neshama is completed in heaven. Misham tekabel kol ha'atidot lavo alav. And it is at that moment that the child will receive all future infusions of all the things that will happen to that child in its life are determined at that specific moment of birth. Ulefichach roi lecha lihitbonein ki hamolid bonim b'shem yirtzalomar kotev kemela mekasho molida term zman ita. And therefore he says you should know that if a person uses incantational magic in order to cause a woman to give birth before the allotted time, ha'amim shahoreg shtei nefashot Upa'amim shegorim lenolad yamim ra'im v'tzarot mishunot zu mizu. You could potentially be causing the death of both mother and child. That's number one. And even if they are both safe, you could be causing the child to live through a terrible life when it was really supposed to have a wonderful life. V'ha'elokim damo yivakesh, and God will seek out the penalty for someone who induces labor in such a way. Meaning that you should not tamper with the mazel of the child by inducing labor, because every child is supposed to be born under a specific mazel, and if you induce labor, you could be causing a child who's supposed to have an amazingly amazing life, and just 5 minutes or a day or a week early, the entire mazel of the child is completely changed from good to bad.
Could it go from bad to good?
Of course, anything could happen. But ubir ze al derech mashal nomar. So the Ravid says, to explain this further, using a mashal, ki ubar ze ra'ui lihivaled biyom ploni b'milui halevana. He says, let's say a child is supposed to be born on a specific day when the moon is full, which is under the sign of Tiferes in the Sulam, in using the Spheros. Uvenesiyusa b'shem Yudke Vavke uvenesiyu shem Chadsho baha mashbia v'holido terem shenitmalei talevana. And using incantational magic, using God's names and other incantations that are found in amulets, maybe a person would have the ability to cause a woman to give birth before the moon is full. Maybe only when it's a little bit over a quarter full. Uviyot mabit eleha mitzoneha umivatle kocha, hine havlad hahu shenolad bizman bittul koach chiyuto yamot beyamim mu'atim. He says, I'm not sure exactly what this means, but the child was supposed to be born under a full moon because it was supposed to be able to utilize the full force of the moon in order to have certain powers and strengths over the course of its life. And now that it is born before the moon is full, it lacks those powers, those abilities. V'damo miyad zeh haposhe yevakesho Elokim ki bitel gezeras yotzro. And God will surely punish the person who hastened or induced the labor through amulet magic because he has nullified God's decree, v'heimita tanefesh hazot v'holido below zmano, causing that child to be born at the inopportune time. V'gorem lo likach mamon she'eno shelo, and furthermore, getting paid for that is getting paid for something that you don't deserve payment for. So it's also a form of geneva. Uchlolo shel davar shina alav kol sidrei bereshis. The general rule is don't tamper with the order of creation. The dai bazel l'chol maven, and that's sufficient. Now, there's more of this type of discussion, but the bottom line is you don't want to tamper with the mazel of the child by inducing labor early. Now, this is heebie-jeebie stuff, okay? This is magical stuff. And normally, ein lanu esek b'nistaros, right? But you're dealing with a person's life. And even though this may be mystical stuff, you have to take it seriously if there are no other medical factors that are taken into consideration. So we now have two reasons. One, Rav Moshe's theological argument, which is don't tamper with God's creation, because the only guarantee that a woman has to give birth safely is if she's under God's guaranteed umbrella, which is only for natural childbirth, not for unnatural childbirth. That's like a theological argument, not so much mystical, but it's sort of like saying God is involved in this process, but only if you let him do it naturally. And then the second argument that we have from a whole series of early commentaries from Rishonim is the argument that you could be tampering with the child's mazel. And as a result of tampering with the child's mazel, you could end up destroying that child's life. For all we know, we don't know. And therefore, don't induce labor unnecessarily or just purely for purely convenience reasons. So I remember I was so angry with the obstetrician for one of my children many years ago. He broke my wife's water with a lance. He induced the labor because his son was coming back from a trip and he needed to pick him up at the airport. And he said, we're going to have this baby. I guarantee you within the next 10 minutes, we're going to have this baby. And we were idiots because we were young kids at the time, so we didn't know any better. But looking back at it, we were so upset with this doctor because for all we know, he may have tampered with our child's mazel. We don't know. And so sometimes doctors are guilty. Sometimes the mother herself is guilty. She doesn't want to delay it. She wants the tax break, whatever. There could be any number of reasons why you want to induce labor. But the bottom line is, don't do it. Don't tamper with God's system, says Rav Moshe. Don't tamper with the child's mazel, says the Ravid and the Rokeach. Hakol yafeh asa bi'ito. God, let things happen naturally unless there is a medical reason to hasten birth. Those are the reasons, those are the things that I want us to look at tonight. Miriam, go ahead.
Hasten birth by, let's say, the mother going for a run the day before, or.
That's still natural. That's all that's natural. That's all natural.
Even breaking the water could be considered natural.
No, breaking the water is not natural. Yeah. Breaking the water is not natural. No, what do you say? It's an interesting topic, right? Yeah.
Every day.
Are we a Halakhic concept from something in Kohelet at the Kolasat?
Yes. Yes, we normally don't. We normally don't, but because this is because we're basically learning a concept. There are many times when we can derive concepts that can be applied halachically. There's a general concept that's involves Jewish thought or theology. You shouldn't tamper with God's creation. This has multiple applications, not just in childbirth. One of the Sefer HaChinuch, just as an example, says the reason why Sirus Behema is asur, why you cannot spay or neuter a pet or an animal for that matter, is because you cannot tamper with God's system. God wants these animals to procreate. What business do you have to tamper with the Bria in that way? So there are other applications of this in trying to understand why certain halachas are the way they are.
Even though it's a hook, people say maybe that's the basis for kilayim by the hands and so on, because you're messing with God's.
Yeah, you're messing with the cosmic fabric. Yeah.
What about agricultural things? If we left it just to gardens.
You're right. You're right. There's so many counter arguments, as you are very aptly providing. Hashem wants us to be his partner in creation, right? To make the world a better place. But there are limitations to even that, right? So that if we go so far as to genetically modify vegetables and fruits, there might be rabbis who would say, you know what, probably better not to genetically modify certain things. You know, maybe if corn is supposed to be eaten a certain way, turning it into high fructose syrup may not actually be the best thing to do. And we're actually seeing the ramifications of us tampering too much and with these highly processed foods and genetically modified things. Anyway, yeah.
Like of all, you talked about the accountant, and you talked about all the different ones. There's one which may have a halachic implication, which is one example he said was the obstetrician going out of town.
Yes.
But the obstetrician going out of town may sound frivolous, but there is a concept of lo menakol.
Yes, you're right. And Rav Zilberstein does say that if this is an expert OB and you're worried that the person replacing this OB is not going to be as expert in delivering of your baby as the other OB is, that still is justification. That would be justification.
Even more than that.
I'm gonna take that a step further. How many times have you gotten a call? This happens to me with somewhat regularity, not uncommon. The model's gonna be out of town. Somebody calls me ahead of time. When are you on vacation? My OB is saying I could get induced. When are you gonna be away? That's a stretch on what labor is saying.
Yeah.
But lo menakol says that there's a school in refuah to have a specific doctor. Right.
It's not even a matter of.
What does that mean? It's not right.
It could just be familiarity with the woman, right? It could be.
No, it's just certain doctors.
Okay. Idea.
I have another,
Oh,
let me just see if another group.
yeah.
Okay, but anyway, thank